Hi, I'm Matt Welch, Editor-in-Chief of Reason Magazine, your Bible for free minds and free markets, and also, pertinently to the conversation we're about to have, an incorrigible media optimist, which is rare in this world. I have the great fortune today to be talking with the distinguished journalist Alex Jones, longtime newspaper man, born and bred, literally, and author most recently of Losing the News, the future of the news that feeds democracy. Alex, how the hell are you?
I'm fine, Matt. It's good to be with you.
It's good to be with you. Let's talk about your book. What's it about? And specifically, if you could tease out your great metaphor that you talk about, especially at the beginning, but also throughout the book, about the iron core of news, what that is, and where is it going?
Well, if you will imagine a kind of a mottled, rusty iron cannonball that is heavy and unwieldy and pitted and imperfect, but weighs a lot. That's the metaphor that I sort of found for what I consider to be the kind of news that's really in jeopardy, what I call the iron core of news. And that is reported news on serious subjects. It means that the Britney Spears reports and editorials and the weather and the crosswords and the sports section and so forth are not part of what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the reported news about what's happening at City Hall, what's happening at the White House, what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan, what's going on in the State House, and the kind of watchdog reporting that investigative reporting represents, the kind of explanatory journalism that is represented by a lot of the coverage we're seeing about the healthcare reform debate, for instance. And as simple as things like going to the mayor's press conference and following up, but with a professional set of standards and a kind of approach to journalism that says, this is what you need to know, what we need to know as a society if we're going to govern ourselves effectively. It means basically allowing people to be informed, to be not just having free speech, but having informed speech. That kind of iron core news has been done mostly by newspapers over the last century. I predict or estimate about 85% of it's done by newspapers. And because of the jeopardy that newspapers are in, because of the digital revolution, and now because of the economic downturn, that kind of news is in real jeopardy. It's in real jeopardy because newspapers are getting rid of the people who do this kind of reporting, and the digital world is making the economic realities for newspapers so difficult that they're trying desperately to find a way to sustain themselves in this very new world we're going into, inevitably, and is coming with many, many great things. But one of the things that it is also bringing is real jeopardy for this kind of news. At least that's the way I look at it.
Now, what is your sense of evidence, anecdotal or impressionistic or otherwise, that the iron core is actually, in aggregate, shrinking?
Well, I think that probably the statistical information would be mostly the reports on the state of the news that are compiled by the Project for Excellence in Journalism. But the more compelling anecdotal evidence is, I think, let me just tell you how I look at it anecdotally, and it's for a metaphor for a lot of what's going on in this country. A few years ago, the two men in the Washington bureau of the San Diego newspaper became aware that the congressional representative from their district, a very powerful Republican named Duke Cunningham, head of the Appropriations Committee, was doing some shady things. And they pursued the story and revealed that he was, in fact, a crook. He is now in jail. He was doing things he was taking bribes. He was really bad news. These two guys won Pulitzer Prizes. This was a very celebrated story. Well, today, the Bureau no longer exists. The newspaper has been sold, and has been sold to people who have no newspaper backgrounds and are basically laying off all kinds of other people. And the two journalists who did this work and won Pulitzer Prizes are no longer there. I think that is the example of what I'm talking about when I say the iron core is in jeopardy, because these are highly paid, often very talented reporters, the expensive reporters, the ones who really know how to do it, but also cost a lot. They've been among the first to go in many newspapers because of the economic climate and the cutbacks that have been necessary. That's a jeopardy, I believe, for our country.
Now, a lot of these newspapers, as you point out in your book, and it's just basic factual knowledge, for the last 40 years, so let's say between 1960 and 2000, we're earning 20% profit margins, 25, even 30,
or more.
30 if it was Gannett or whatever. And they're big operations too. We're talking about it's a lot of millions of dollars pocketed. Why should we weep for people who made that much money? And by that I mean the owners and the employees too, who then belatedly are not making as much money and then make bad decisions about who to fire.
Well, I think that you ought to remember that the people who are not surviving are not the companies, but the journalists who've been doing this kind of work.
Well, some of the companies
I think
too.
They're the ones you should be weeping about. But I think the thing is that it's been a deal from the very beginning in the newspaper business that, the newspaper business became a real business in the latter part of the 19th century. And it was a commercial enterprise. They were there to make money in many respects. But they made a deal, effectively, that said we will do, when we claim to be in this, doing something that's a public service, that is in the interest of the public, the way we show that is by providing this kind of news. And we're going to make money at it, but we're also going to provide this kind of news. And basically, they did to better and lesser degrees, but they did that over, more than a century. I think that the fact that they were fat and happy for a while in the 60s to the 80s and 90s even, is really, not really germane to what I'm talking about. They're not fat and happy now, as you very well know. But the point is that what they did while they were fat and happy also served the public interest, because it was during that period when a significant part of the money that they made went into expanded, news staffs and giving more room in their news organizations, newspapers and magazines and whatnot to this kind of news. Now, they did other things too. They did other things. They sold the package. And the people who bought the newspaper didn't necessarily buy it for the serious news. They bought it for the crosswords or the sports or the cartoons. But they bought it and they got the package. The package was what was sold, and they got the news with it. And effectively, they subsidized the real expense, the journalistic real expense of a newspaper, which goes into hiring highly qualified, talented people who want to do this kind of news. I would say among the journalists I know, the vast majority of them go into journalism to do this kind of news. That's what attracts them to it. But I think that increasingly, they're not going to be able to make a living unless we find some way to solve this economic conundrum that keeps these enterprises afloat, not fat and happy, but afloat.
Part of this, my observation, I worked at the LA Times from 2006 and 2007. You talk about the LA Times quite a lot in your book, especially the former editor John Carroll, who came there via the Baltimore Sun. And the LA Times has become sort of a poster child for a newspaper in distress. They've gone through a series of both publishers and editors, kind of nonstop conflicts and controversies and embarrassments. And I can certainly testify that the spirit inside the building at any given time makes a funeral look like a party. At the same time, my experience with it at least, and I acknowledge that I come as a strange outsider to most discussions of journalism on some level, is that you can still find huge evidence of fat left over, and what I'd like to term is sort of monopolist thinking. I think that monopolies can create virtues and it can create vices. One of the virtues is something that you've talked about, sort of the public spirit, that you could basically subsidize this type of extensive news gathering, this internal spirit towards, we feel like we have to create this accountability journalism, these investigative reports. Let's make that happen and create kind of what you describe in the book as a virtuous circle of investment and profit. But that was contingent on not having any competition. And once competition shows up, then it starts eating away at that bundle. But there's a dark side to that monopoly, in my experience too, is that you have a kind of hostility towards your very consumers. I mean, I can't count the number of times people said to me when I was at the paper, "Oh, can we just fire our readers?" I mean, there's a sense that the readers were the problem, not anything that they were doing. The attitude that I would see was akin to that of a post office in Central Europe in the early 90s. There's sort of a kind of a surliness, and I can't help but think that is some of the seeds of the current crisis. They weren't, in many different respects, able or in a position, even though they're making all that much money, to shift the mentality to that of competition. What's your...
Well, I don't look at it quite that way. I mean, I certainly think that, there were plenty of fat and happy newspapers. There are not many anymore. And complacency and, smugness, perhaps, newspapers have been near monopolies in terms of print, anyway, in most cities. Most cities have only had one.
Since around
Los Angeles,
post-war.
though, I mean, I think let's be fair here. Los Angeles was a gigantic area that was served by an enterprise that had twice as many reporters as it now does, and I can't believe that has not damaged some of the quality for the readers of the Los Angeles Times.
Certainly has.
They don't even have a book review.
There is no doubt about that.
That was one of their great showcases. I mean, I guess the point I'm making is this. I'm not trying to be an apologist for newspapers. I just think that you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what's happening is something that is affecting the quantity and quality of news, but it's also affecting other things as well that I talk about in this book. It affects the things that go with this kind of institutional journalism that we've had, that people have been rightly critical of, but I think that has its virtues. The idea of journalistic objectivity, that's very much in play now as these institutions are floundering and trying frantically to find ways to attract, readers and eyeballs to their websites and so forth. The idea of journalism ethics is something that is in jeopardy, in my opinion, because of what's happening. I think the whole idea of the securities that the First Amendment offers have been, in many respects, the champions of those things that we now take for granted about the First Amendment have been things that the newspapers in this country and the news organizations in this country have championed and have now become, part and parcel of what we assume, but which we have certainly not always had. Even into the 20th century, it was illegal. You could go to jail in World War I for just opposing the war. Those days changed mainly because of the diligent efforts and challenges that were brought by news organizations and the Supreme Court changing its mind about what the law of the land should be. But the news organizations in this country as institutions have been really powerful, and I believe that the institutions of newspapers in most towns are especially important for the community in terms of its identity. And I think it also is a very important delivery system for journalism that changes things. I'll give you an example. Here in Boston, the Boston Globe has been having, a terrible time. It's been having a very difficult time. There's even been thought that it may go dark. It would, literally cease publication. Well, that, I think, would be a catastrophe for all of New England. The point that I'm trying to make is that a few years ago, I went to my, front door, and the Sunday paper above the fold was a huge story that the Boston Globe broke about how the Catholic Church had been protecting priests who had been sexual predators for children. This is a story that was all over the front page. The Catholic Church had no comment. That was the only thing in that Sunday's huge story was a no comment from the Catholic Church. But because of the institutional power of the Boston Globe and because of the power of what they had reported, the Catholic Church could not ignore it. And that story not only affected Boston, but all of America and then all of the world. This has been a story that has grown legs, but it started because of the Boston Globe. But in fact, it didn't start with the Boston Globe. Much of what was reported in that story by the Boston Globe had already been reported. It had been reported by the alternative newspaper in town, but it didn't matter that they did it. The point was, it took the Boston Globe, the institution of the Boston Globe, to power that information into the public mind and to force the Catholic Church to come to grips with this. I think that losing that institutional power is almost as damaging as losing the reporters. And I don't see that being compensated by startups on the web, at least not yet.
That's a very interesting example. My instinct toward it would be to talk about the alternative paper that broke it, right?
Yeah, but the alternative paper, it made no imprint. It made no impact. The Catholic Church ignored them.
Right.
The Catholic Church could not ignore what the Boston Globe did.
No, that's I think a very interesting dynamic to think about, because I think it's irrefutable that we live in a time that there are more entities, regardless of exactly how you would categorize them, but more entities committing acts of journalism than we've ever had.
There are lots of good stories on the web. There's lots of good, interesting, high-quality journalism, investigative journalism, important journalism. But I think without the delivery system still of these institutions, those things are not going to get the attention that they should get. At least in many cases, they won't. In many cases, what happens on the web, the role of the web has been not only to, in some cases generate news, but mostly it's been an echo chamber to keep news alive and force the press, in the institutional press, to take notice. And when the institutional press took notice, then the story became a very big story. We've seen that happen, any number of times. I think that is the point is you don't want, I believe, it's not in our interest to lose those institutions, and I hope we won't.
I think it's an interesting evolutionary question, sort of a follow-up to that, is that power of sheer sort of institutional heft and ability to put stories in people's faces in such a way that they have to react. Is that evolving? Is that evolving to a place like the Drudge Report that doesn't do much of any original reporting, but which 10 million people a day look at, and if it really wants to hammer home the story with legs, that story's going to travel at least a little bit.
I'm not so sure that's what I would not necessarily agree with that. I think it depends on the story.
Right, it has to
if
be
it's
the
the story of Monica Lewinsky, then okay, because the Drudge Report, basically broke the story that Newsweek was about to break the story. I mean, there's no question that the web is a great system for, viral, spreading of news and especially for sensational things and breaking news. But the kind of news I'm talking about is far broader than just breaking news. It's far broader than a Monica Lewinsky story. It's the healthcare story, for instance. That's a story that takes time and effort, and it is not that you're not it's not available in some respects online. You can find infinite amounts of information on any subject online now. But you could have found vast amounts of information on any subject in libraries before, but that didn't mean that people went to libraries and spent their time there. I think that people basically need to be directed, and I think that, in terms of calling their attention to important things, especially watchdog kinds of things. And I think that the power of journalism to do that, in part, is a reflection of whether there is going to be a viable, mainstream media industry. If that's not going to exist, it's going to have to be replaced, and maybe it will. But I think that getting rid of what we have on the bet that it will is a long shot.
Well, I, for one, don't think that I kind of agree with your long-term prognosis of the industry that newspapers that we know today are largely going to continue existing. I think we differ on what form that might take, but I don't think that we're talking about, a meteor is going to land and everyone's going to die. I think we will see quite a few more bankruptcies. It's not going to be just a handful of newspapers that go bankrupt. There's going to be some zero newspaper towns.
Well, there may be, but I think that most of the newspapers that are in bankruptcy now are in bankruptcy because they're not making their debt payments, not because they are not making an operating profit. They've cut back so significantly that most newspapers in this country are making an operating profit. But my thesis and my purpose in writing this book was not to save newspapers per se. If newspapers are saved as commercial enterprises by becoming the equivalent of local television news, in which they never touch anything that's going to make anybody mad, and the only consideration they have is what will drive eyeballs to their website, then they're going to abandon Iron Core news, because Iron Core news is not necessarily crowd-pleasing news. It's not necessarily the news that people, necessarily gravitate to in great numbers. But it's very important that somebody is doing it and that it's being done in a way that compels attention. That's where I have the problem with newspapers. I think they will survive, but I don't want them to back away from this commitment they've made historically to doing journalism in the public interest. That would be, if they back away from that commitment, then it really doesn't matter socially anyway whether they survive or not.
I went through. I was just thinking this morning. I did a blog post on our blog about a bunch of different pieces of legislation that Arnold Schwarzenegger signed in the last, waning hours of their legislative session today. And the purpose of it was mostly to cherry pick funny-sounding laws like a double in the fine for boat abandonment and things like that. It's something, if you're from California like I am, it's always a great time of the year to find funny things. But in the process of doing this, I used Google News to look for, Schwarzenegger laws passed, signed, something like that. And I found probably a dozen laws that were discussed. And the news sites, and I mean, there we are talking about the Iron Core, right? This is the definition of it. This is, this is legislation being passed that can affect people. And the sites that I came up with, and I wasn't looking for diversity. I was looking for stories attached to a bill. And the first one that came up, I would link to it. I had like a boating newsletter in the case of that one. I had health insurance websites. I had a sort of a PR newswire thing. I wrote them down. I had Reading.com. I had MTV.com.
I think that's scandalous. I think that's appalling. I think it's appalling because the news organizations in California have all but abandoned Sacramento.
Well,
they basically walked away from it. I think that's appalling.
Although I agree that many of them have, the Mercury News and the LA Times and a few others certainly have not. They still cover it, although not to the degree that I would like. I should point out that I also saw the Mercury News and the Santa Cruz Sentinel and other kinds of things. But I find it interesting that hiphopnews.com, produced a story about the Donda West law, Kanye West's mom, who died in plastic surgery, and they created a new law to hopefully prevent that from happening or whatever the hell it was. But for me, the story there is, as much as it might be that, these laws, and we're talking hundreds, so that's pretty hard to cover in a general interest newspaper, right? But the fact is that now we have such a wide variety of people who might have a narrow interest in a little piece of that. But it makes it easy for me, the consumer, to go out and find things that I wouldn't have been able to see if I was just relying on
news. Well, maybe Hip Hop News, the site, is one that inspires you with confidence. But it would seem to me you're giving your confidence away pretty cheaply and quickly. I mean, I don't think you know anything about that institution, who wrote it, what their axe to grind was, what the issues were.
No, but they linked,
the problem is
to the bill.
Advocacy kind of journalism is something that has its place, but not, as far as I'm concerned, that should not be the first line of journalism. That's something that is like hiring a lawyer. You're going to get an argument, but you're going to get cherry-picked facts. I don't think necessarily you're going to get the kind of reporting on the subjects that is going to allow you to feel like you really are informed. Now, it may be that if you're, I think it's unrealistic to think that the LA Times is going to cover every law in the state legislature. But it seems to me, given the financial and government crisis that seems to be going on in California, it's appalling that you're having to rely on that kind of outfit to tell you what's going on.
Well, I don't. I rely on them to let me know that there's this one law called the Donda West law, which they provided a hyperlink to the text of the bill. And for my purposes, I'm looking for laws that were passed. They have served me right. I don't go. I won't wake up tomorrow.
The web offers, as I say, vast reservoirs that are only getting more vast of information of all kinds. And I don't have any doubt that there are going to be, as the mainstream press, as the iron core of reported news dwindles, it is going to be a vacuum that is going to be filled. And it's going to be filled by advocates and public relations and people who are going to be giving information. And it's probably going to look a lot like news. It's going to look like reported news. but it's not, as far as I'm concerned, going to be highly credible. At least some of it is going to be calculated to persuade you to do something or believe something that may or may not be the case. I think that's, I have no argument with people doing that. But if that is if that's the way you get your news, then I think you have to recognize that that's what you're getting.
Well, I think the point is that it's the way that consumers are supplementing their news, right? People are using Google News and seeing what comes up there. And
well, Google News, well, okay. I mean, as I say, I think that I use Google News, frequently. But and I might go to a specialty site like that. But that would not be where I would go if I was expecting to get a dispassionate analysis of a piece of legislation.
Right, but I think an interesting question that newspapers face is that, by definition, in many ways, and with some exceptions, I would include the New York Times and Wall Street Journal as exceptions to that. But generally speaking, they're generalists, right? They are trying to take a what happened yesterday kind of, or what's an important thing that you didn't realize that we just spent 6 months investigating. But it's from the perspective of someone who's a generalist, and a generalist can't cover everything. And so you have these supplementary things, and this sort of segues into something that's of interest to me.
Well, you've always had like newsletters and things like that in specialty areas. I mean, it's essentially the equivalent of that, except it's faster and easier to get access to.
Yeah, which for me is a wonderful thing, as is the fact that people can go out individually and aggregate them and package them in an interesting way and add their own expertise. If you were going on the web tomorrow to look at a new Supreme Court decision, I presume you might go to the New York Times, or maybe go to Slate.com, but you might very well go to SCOTUSblog.com and Volok.com, because there are places where people are adding their specialist knowledge into things like the law and Supreme Court cases and stuff that you have easy access to that you didn't before. But I don't want you to respond to that, because I had a point that I want to make. No, I wrote a book about John McCain, a critical one before the 2008 election came out, 2007. And I bring this up because you draw a distinction between advocacy journalism and sort of more of an iron core, objective, newspapery journalism, for lack of a better term. And I was interested specifically in the idea of what he thinks about the proper role of government, which is pretty close to sort of your definition of some accountability journalism. Is how is the government being used? What do citizens need to know? In the process of doing that, I've read everything that's been written about the guy, pretty much. And what I found to be, almost without exception, the most useful in terms of longer pieces written about him, all come from places that I think that you put in more of an accuracy or advocacy journalism pen, right? I'm thinking of John Judas wrote a great piece in the New Republic. The Weekly Standard had a couple of phenomenal pieces from Tucker Carlson to other people. Vanity Fair had a terrific profile. The Phoenix New Times had a series of wonderful pieces about him, Playboy magazine. And almost none of that, with the exception of the Arizona Republic, came from newspapers. And I would add even further that the newspapers themselves, because they are in a generalist posture, when you have an incredibly outsized, phenomenally interesting character like John McCain, because of your generalism, it's important to sort of rehash the many highlights of biography before you get around to sort of the suddenly more obscure question of what he thinks that the government ought to do. For me, that suggests that perhaps we should create more space for respect for that kind of advocacy journalism. Because
well, I would only say that if it satisfies you, that's your business. But it seems to me that what would satisfy me if I read those articles was to have the feeling that the books were being cooked or that they were not. If I don't believe me, I don't think that objectivity, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't mean that you don't have a point of view. I think you very well may have a point of view. In fact, it's phony objectivity to pretend that every side of every argument is equally valid. I don't believe that is objectivity at all. But there's a difference between that and basically doing a job on Jonathan on a candidate in which you selectively choose things that you may find makes an interesting story, but may distort his record. Now, if it doesn't do that, then as far as I'm concerned, that's the kind of journalism I'm looking for.
That's what I'm
saying. I want something that I have some confidence.
Me as a consumer, that's exactly how I experienced it.
The places you've cited are places that have all done highly credible journalism, but they're not sort of rants and screeds. They are reported and they are backed by facts, and they give the perspective that makes the argument and makes it in a plausible way that cites evidence. That's the objectivity that I'm for.
Right, and I think that and correct me if I'm wrong, in your book you sort of say, there's a place for advocacy journalism.
Absolutely.
And your but is rather large. I'm suggesting, and this is not a personal comment about your physical size, that maybe the but should be a bit smaller in this case. That if you take the sort of spirit of I'm looking for the truth, I'm looking for facts, I am not interested in lies, then advocacy journalism can be in many places just as, if not more, valuable than a generalist journalism that doesn't, because it doesn't have the same motivations.
I think we're confusing ideas here, because I'm not talking about generalist journalism. I'm talking about specialist, highly, refined, knowledgeable journalism done perhaps by a newspaper. I don't think that necessarily means you don't know what you're talking about beyond, a generalist. I think there are newspaper and have been articles in places that, like the New York Times, about all the candidates that have been very penetrating, as far as I'm concerned. But I don't think that's the kind of thing that I'm not trying to argue for boring news. What I'm saying is that if you take away the standard that says you need to present all sides of something, if there is another side to it, if there is an argument, if there are facts that you're leaving out, then that is not, as far as I'm concerned, reliable journalism. And I think advocacy journalism basically is like public relations. It's not that it tells things that are false. It selects the things it chooses to emphasize. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with it as an idea. But I don't think that it's, the kind of journalism that is going to ultimately be the most persuasive. I don't think people change their minds about Iraq because of arguments. I think they changed their minds because people went to Iraq and persuaded people who had been for it that the reality on the ground was something other than what they'd been told. I don't think that was done with arguments. I think it was done with facts.
You talk very movingly in your book about your family and your family's involvement in the newspaper. Talk a little bit about that, sort of the history that you marinated in and how that kind of influenced the way that you thought, influenced even your career as a journalism, and specifically the kind of arguments that you make in the book.
Well, I grew up in a as you indicate, I'm in the fourth generation of a newspaper family that still operates a small daily newspaper in Greenville, Tennessee, circulation about 15,000. My father, who's 94, is still alive and is the publisher, and I have two brothers and a brother-in-law who are active in the management of the paper. And the paper serves the role that I think a newspaper or any news organization should try to fill in its community. It tries to reflect the community. It tries to, embrace and bolster the community, and it tries to be the truth teller to the community. It tries to and accepts the reality that, as my father once told me, if you're doing your job, sooner or later you're going to make everybody mad. But if you're doing your job over a period of time, they come to value that. I think that is the concept of journalism that means most to me, and I think that the way that newspapers in this country can be most faulted is that they've lost that kind of trust with the communities that they are in many cases. They've lost the ability to make that contact. I think it has to do with the homogenization of newspapers in the same way that if you arrive in the outskirts of any town in America now, it all looks exactly the same. It's the Taco Bell and the Burger King, and you might as well be anywhere. That's not what I think newspapers should be like. Newspapers should be space-specific. We live now in a digital world that is non-geographic, but we also live in a particular place. We also live in a geographical world. And I think most people want to feel that they have a connection with that place and should have a connection. And the way, one of the great facilitators of that connection, in my opinion, is a newspaper that you can count on to look over the shoulders of the people in power and tell you what's going on, and at the same time not condescend to you and reflect the place where you are, and reflect, in some respects, the values of the place where you are in terms of the story selection and the things that are emphasized. I mean, like for instance, in a place like my hometown in Greenville, Tennessee, religion is a very important part of people's lives. I think that ought to be an important part of the way the newspaper reports. It ought to report about what's going on in America, in the churches in a town like this. At the same time, the people who live in this community are deeply, deeply concerned, like everybody ought to be, about the air they breathe and the water they drink and the sewer systems that they have and the environment that they live in, and whether the companies who are there in the town are doing the right thing or the wrong thing as far as the EPA is concerned. That's the kind of thing that a newspaper ought to be absolutely telling the people that it serves about, and I believe if they do that better, then people would feel more, alarmed at the idea that they may be disappearing.
I once talked to I believe a software salesman who traveled around, especially sort of the Midwest and the South, middle of the country in any case, and he had the same observation that you did, which is that you go to any newspaper, any town, on a sales call, and the newspapers kind of look the same. Maybe they run the same AP stories. It's the same handful of Mario Garcia approved designs and this kind of thing. And he was so frustrated by that on one hand, and at the same time sensed a market opportunity, that he ended up launching a series of free tabloid newspapers beginning in Nashville. I think it's called The Scene or something like that. Maybe I'm confusing it with the Alt Weekly there. But my question to you is, why did that happen? I totally agree.
I'll tell you why I think it happened. I think it happened because newspapers became, cogs in a corporate wheel. I mean, my family is one of the very few exceptions. So when I was growing up in the 1950s, the Tennessee Press Association was filled with people and families who were just like we were, who ran little newspapers in small towns, and we would meet, in Gatlinburg every summer for a convention, and we all knew each other, and this was the life that we had. It was a real way of life. I think that when newspapers became good businesses, corporations began, buying them up. And what I could really, honestly, I was very confused about this when I was a child. I was saying to my father, why would people sell? I mean, because you're not just selling your business, you're selling your life. Because when you are in the newspaper in our family is like a living member of the family. It was there at the dinner table every night. My father, I don't think, ever got through dinner without having somebody call, usually to complain about something. That was the reality for our life, but it was something that made us feel as a family that we had we felt just, and I mean this may sound grandiose, but we felt just as much a responsibility for our newspaper in that community as the Sulzberger family feels about their stewardship of the New York Times. We were the family that owned the newspaper, and that meant something. As far as my father's name was always in the phone book, that was the way we lived. We lived with the people that we reported about. And I think that is something that when you go to corporate ownership and you start shuffling senior executives who don't have links with the community and people in and out, and changes and the priorities become, the corporate earnings. And, the newspaper business has always been a cyclical business. It is up and down. And if you are in a corporate environment, especially if you're a public corporation, then Wall Street's looking over your shoulder. They're demanding the money. And that is something that I think has worked very much to the detriment of the newspaper business in this country. That said, newspapers are still the engines, overwhelmingly the engines of this kind of Iron Core news. And I don't want to take that away from them.
I've always thought the concept, the kind of mostly post-war concept of professionalism in newspapers to be sort of a double-edged sword or a two-track meaning, or fill in the blank metaphor. I mean, on one hand, you had sort of a standardization of papers, a great consolidation. I think, in retrospect, almost a grievous consolidation of newspapers, especially in places like LA that used to have a very robust newspaper culture. And then within the newsroom, there was, in my mind, a largely but not totally beneficial side element of professionalization, where there was a much more self-conscious approach towards, here's the quality that we should be doing, here's what we should be embarrassed by. I think there was a kind of a group ritual slaughter of William Randolph Hearst that happened after World War II. I'm a Hearst fan, so I'm a little bit mixed about that. But I think both of those worked hand in hand, sometimes together very well, and I think lately much less well. But I wonder if part of that kind of newsroom professionalization, as we call it, led to sort of a concept of career track where a small town like yours is seen as much as a stepping stone as it is a place that you want to live, interact with, and exude with.
I would say yes and no. I don't see anything wrong with the stepping stone idea. I liked getting young, ambitious journalists, and I hired any number of them, and they went on to, bigger newspapers. I didn't begrudge that. I think they contributed, but I don't think that should be all you had. We also had people who had been there for their whole lives, who had been there, it was their, started off, I remember one of our best writers started off as a linotype, operator. The point is, I think you need a mix. I think that the point that you're making is a legitimate one in terms of people who come and don't connect, don't invest, and are just using it as a stepping stone. But I also think that if you have the right leadership in the newsroom, you can take talented people who are not going to be there forever, and they can make a huge contribution to the newspaper and to the way it serves its community. A lot of this, I think, has mostly to do with the leadership in a newsroom. And if the editors are people who really inspired the mission, then I think that's going to be reflected in the newspaper. And if they don't, then that's going to be the other way around.
Towards the end of your book, you talk about the impact that the web has had on things and about the approach that newspaper companies have taken towards their websites. And you even advocate that basically they should think, in terms of two separate things. You have a newspaper, you have a website, and they should be staffed by different people and thought of as separate entities. Well, why is that? What's the benefit of that?
Well, I'll tell you why. I think it's the whole idea now at most news organizations is that reporters should be able to do anything, and many of them can do everything to a degree. But I can tell you, as a reporter who spent an awful lot of his life reporting and working on deadlines, that if you're filing several times a day, and you're filing online, and you're filing in print, and you're doing a podcast, and you're doing things for cell phones and so forth, you're doing an awful lot of things that are not reporting. And the quality of the reporting is suffering because of the urgency, one, and the lack of time. My whole point is that the web is its own media culture. It's going to be and should be something that is done by people who are web people, who do journalism in the web way, who are conversant with it, whose approach to it is to make the web experience of journalism as rich as it possibly can be, and it can be extraordinarily rich. But I think that to try to turn newspaper men and women into people who do everything is defeating the purpose of, altogether. It's like, with radio reporting. I think that, to the degree that NPR is trying to sort of back away from being about radio and become something that is multimedia, I think that's a mistake. I don't think that's what NPR ought to be. I think the website at NPR ought to be for radio, webcasts. It shouldn't be to try to be the New York Times or ABC or CNN. As far as I'm concerned, that's a mistake when you're trying, because doing radio journalism is a very tough thing. Doing newspaper journalism is a tough thing. Doing, web journalism is going to be something that is going to offer all kinds of opportunities. But the best of it is going to be done by people who are really conversant and focused on using the medium and know the medium, and that's where they want to be. I believe that is I think that's a better way of doing it. Unfortunately, the resources aren't there. If the resources were there, that's the way I would do it.
I, as someone who edits a print monthly magazine, but also contributes to a daily weblog and writes a lot online, and even contributes to a video journalism site, I have, I think, a somewhat different view. For me, part of what every news company should be doing is reinforcing, extending, and strengthening its brand. This is what I always preached when I was at the LA Times, is yes, there are things that you can do online that you can't do in print, and one of the best things is actually to strengthen the bonds with your readers. As you were talking about your hometown newspaper, the web has a marvelous interactive element that allows you to do that. But at the same time, you shouldn't necessarily be seeing this as this place doesn't have the same culture as this place. It doesn't have the same values. My argument has been inflict the best of your values from the print product and put them online. Just have a variable publishing schedule.
Well, don't misunderstand me. I think that for the news organizations that are the branded news organizations, they need absolutely to have those values embedded. I think there's going to be a whole different kind of web news institutions that are going to grow up, that are going to have a whole different set of values, that are going to be, they're going to do politics as humor or video games or who knows what. I think that the news organizations are going to need to protect those values if they're going to be the successful, respected, enduring institutions for news. And I think, again, my only objective in saying what I said is to facilitate reporting, the quality and quantity of reporting. I think that, as I say, if you ask someone to do everything, then they may be able to do everything. But if they're not going to be able to do everything equally well. And I think that the point is, I'm talking about daily journalism here especially, if you're filing, as I know a lot of newspaper reporters are and people at the New York Times, if you're filing in many different mediums and doing it many times a day, you don't have a lot of time to report.
You spent a lot of time at the New York Times. How many years total?
9.
New York Times for a variety of different people and for a variety of different reasons is a touchstone. Some people just, in the journalism profession, or newspaper profession especially, it is widely seen as the gold standard and has been since I got into the business a long time ago. For a lot of people on the outside, it can either be the liberal bogeyman, or it can be they're selling out to the right wing, people who are working the refs and this kind of stuff. It's a lightning rod. Tell us what you think are some of the common misconceptions that people have about the place as someone who has worked on the inside of it.
Well, I think the most common misconception is that anytime anything happens, it's calculatedly done for a reason and is part of a conspiracy of some kind to make one thing or another appear one way or the other. In my experience, someone once said journalism, daily journalism especially, is done on horseback. It really is. And I think that the problem that I have is with people who see something and immediately believe that it's a product of bias. And it may be bias, but it more often, in my experience, is either something that was wrong or something that reflected a judgment that the person would not have made themselves, but could be a legitimate one in some other context and so forth. I think that, look, this is done by human beings, but I know at the New York Times, having been there, and believe me, I am not uncritical of the New York Times when I feel like the New York Times steps away. But I think that the New York Times, I believe sincerely that the New York Times is a place that takes journalism very seriously and that really tries to play it straight. I did. when I was a journalist there. I really tried to play it straight, and it was especially important to play it straight at a place like the New York Times because it does have the kind of power that it does. It's something that I believe people ought to revere, and I believe that if we didn't have the New York Times, which is almost a miracle that it exists at all, it is in the hands of a family like the one it is in the hands of, I think we would miss it terribly as a nation. I mean, I think that the fact that the New York Times, in the face of all of its great financial reversals, has basically not done what the Los Angeles Times did. It has not decimated its news staff. It's had some layoffs, but nothing remotely comparable to what's happened at the LA Times. I think that's something that speaks to the management and the ownership, a different kind of management and ownership, and a sense that also their business interests are based on the quality, the perceived quality of the New York Times. I believe they're right about that. And so, I'm just hoping that the institution is going to be able to continue.
Point to some publications, trends, anything that give you cause for optimism about the future of the
I have a good deal of optimism. One of the main reasons is I think there's so many young people who are, thrilled by the potential that the web has and are entering journalism because they want to make a difference. I mean, I think that there's journalism schools are reporting record enrollments. I mean, it's hard to understand in some contexts, but not in others. In one sense, there's never been a better time to be a graduate of a journalism school with a background that tells you how to, operate all the bells and whistles and to be very conversant with web culture, because that's what everyone in every news organization seems to be looking for right now. But I think the thing is that the belief in journalism is genuinely there and alive. I think most people understand that it is in our national interest for the institution of journalism and its, watchdog role in this iron core news. Even if you don't want to read it, you want somebody to be watching City Hall and watching what's going on in the school system. And if you don't, then, you're probably not a very engaged citizen, and you're probably you're probably not buying a newspaper or even reading news online anyway. I think the important thing is that newspapers are still, for the most part, able to make an operating profit. I think they've got a chance when the economy improves to, rebuild some of their repertorial muscle. I think that is what will win them the support of their communities, that will be able to keep them in business. They're not going to be fat and happy ever again. But that doesn't mean they can't survive and can't continue to do this job. It is a job they do for all of us.
One reason why I'm a perennial optimist, besides congenital insanity, is that, broadly speaking, the publications or news organizations that do the best work are the ones who have the best circulation and the biggest audience. I mean, 60 Minutes, I'm not a huge fan of it, but there's no doubt that they've done probably more investigative journalism over the years than most people have. It's still a super popular show. The New York Times is a very successful newspaper, even though they've had some operating budget troubles. The Wall Street Journal, the USA Today just took a hammering on circulation. They do quality work every day. I think they're pretty underrated as far as that goes. The Economist, they're booming. It's a high-quality magazine.
But the thing is, those aren't enough. We need, good quality newspapers in Minneapolis and in Dallas and in Houston. And we need them in places like Greenville, Tennessee. Every place needs a newspaper, or if not a newspaper, some kind of a news organization that has not only the will, but the resources to do the job. And when they are confronted with opposition and efforts to boycott or lawsuits or things like that, that have the stones and the wherewithal to do the job anyway.
Before we wrap up, there have been a lot of discussions, even hearings on Capitol Hill, about ways that politics and the law can be used to sort of address the modern state of journalism across a variety of fora, whether it's the idea of a shield law, but more importantly, like tweaking nonprofit laws and abilities for newspapers to sort of collude with one another to set prices. What's your take on some of those proposals?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because just in the next day or so, we're going to be releasing an analysis done by a lawyer here at Harvard who is an expert in nonprofit governance, who makes a very detailed analysis, and her perspective is that not only does the law not need to be changed, but none of the IRS rulings need to be changed, and that newspapers and news organizations that are failing can become nonprofits without Congress doing anything. So I hope that, I think that it's going to be a mixed bag. I think there are going to be some places that will look for that as the alternative to going out of business. I certainly regard that as a better alternative than going out of business, but my hope is that there's going to be a way to keep these enterprises alive as, commercial, viable, strong institutions that can do all the things that need to be done, which includes, facing down power, fighting lawsuits, doing the kinds of things that take money and power.
In my brief time at the LA Times, I saw enthusiasm for ownership fads change every 4 months or so, from the nonprofit kind of Pointer Institute model to the benighted local billionaire model to the let's just take it off of Wall Street model, many of which were tried either at the LA Times or up in Santa Barbara to pretty disastrous effects. So I treat with some skepticism all of that, and I just want to say to anyone out there who's a newspaper editor thinking about going nonprofit, there are some of us out here in the political journalism world who have been working for nonprofits like the Reason Foundation, and you should ask us first. No, I mean, it's a great existence. We're actually growing and not shrinking, and there's many good things that come with that. But I just think that newspapers specifically, I mean, that culture, which you talk about in your book of newspaper editor conferences in the 1970s, where the editors would all get up and just talk holy crap about their publishers, their bosses. There was this real sort of defiant culture. That culture is very strong. It's been largely beneficial, and under almost every single sort of newfangled ownership that's being contemplated would be directly threatened in ways that people, I don't think, truly understand.
I think you're right. I'm going to have to go.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you, Matt.
And hope to talk to you again soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
So long.